They knocked him down like he didn't matter. A black boy in a wheelchair alone in the hallway, surrounded by laughter that cut deeper than the fall itself. No one moved, no one spoke, until one girl, quiet, steady and tired of the silence, stepped forward. What happened next didn't just shake the school, it sparked a movement. This isn't just a story about bullying, it's a story about rising, about finding your voice when the world tries to erase you, and about the moment when two students, one rolling, one standing, rewrote what real strength looks like in front of the entire school. Stay with us, because once you hear how it ends, you'll never forget how it began. It was a breezy Thursday morning at Jefferson Middle School in Birmingham, Alabama, the kind of morning where the sun rose with purpose and the wind whispered quiet warnings through the chain-link fences that wrapped around the school like an old secret, and the cracked asphalt in the parking lot groaned beneath the weight of squealing bus tires and sneakered feet. Dozens of students spilled out into the open like marbles from a loose pouch, buzzing into tight clusters, clutching iced coffees and cell phones, their backpacks dragging low like anchors. Some laughing, some scrolling, others just scanning for someone who'd make them feel seen. But for 13-year-old Jaylen Moore, there was no rush, no chatter, no expectant gaze. He sat alone near the base of the faded flagpole, his wheelchair angled just enough to catch the breeze on his face, watching the crowd part around him like water around a stone there, but unnoticed. Jaylen was used to that. Born with spina bifida, he had spent every day of his life with wheels beneath him. And while his legs may not have carried him across playgrounds or gym floors, his mind had wandered to distant galaxies and inner universes no one else could touch. His eyes deep thoughtful, always listening, rarely blinked during class, and his answers were the kind that made even the tiredest teachers smile, as if the boy in the back, with the quiet voice and louder heart, saw more than most. But in middle school, kindness didn't matter as much as conformity and difference. Even the noble kind was currency worth less than a whisper. That morning, as the tide of students swelled toward the entrance, Jaylen took a breath, pushed his wheels forward slowly, one hand slightly tighter than the other, thanks to an old elbow injury. He was nearly at the front ramp, the one sloping gently to the school's double doors, when they stepped in front of him, three shadows tall and smug, led by none other than Logan Carter, the 8th grade linebacker, whose name was spray-painted in bold red letters on the gym's mural wall, as if he owned not just the field, but the school itself. Logan didn't say much, didn't need to. He just stood there, arms folded, his two friends Derek and Troy flanking him like mismatched bookends. Jaylen stopped instinctively, not out of fear, but because he'd learned long ago that direct confrontation often ended with bruises, emotional, if not physical. Yo, Derek grinned, stepping forward. You ever thought about installing hydraulics on that thing? Maybe race it around the track. He flicked the rim of Jaylen's wheel like it was a toy. Jaylen's fingers tightened slightly, still silent. Then Logan leaned down the sun, casting a long shadow across his jaw, and without warning, grabbed the front handles of Jaylen's chair. "Let's make room, boys," he said casually, and with one swift jerk, tilted the chair backward. It happened fast, too fast for Jaylen to react. His body pitched sideways. The world spun and he hit the ground, hard shoulder, first, then, elbow his backpack sliding off a book, skidding across the pavement like it wanted to flee. Time paused. For just one aching second, there was silence. Then came the laughter. Quiet at first like a crack in the air, then louder, careless, cruel. Some students covered their mouths, others turned away. But no one moved. Jaylen lay still, not crying, not calling for help, just breathing through the humiliation, staring up at the flag snapping above him, as if it too refused to lower itself to his level. He whispered something then, too soft to hear, but it wasn't a plea. It was a promise. And that's when someone did move. Her name was Keisha Brown, and until that morning, most students hadn't noticed her much either. She wasn't class president, not captain of any team, didn't wear the trendiest clothes or post TikToks that made people laugh. But she had a presence that settled deep in a room like roots stretching beneath the surface. Keisha had just stepped off bus 12, earbuds still in, when she saw the last few seconds of the fall, the cruel smirk on Logan's face. The high five he gave Troy the way Jaylen didn't fight, didn't flinch, just lay there like gravity was the only truth left. Her fingers clenched, pulling her backpack strap tight, and before she knew it, she was moving, shouldering through the crowd like a storm. "Hey!" Her voice cracked through the courtyard like thunder. Logan turned, half amused, half annoyed. Mind your business, he muttered, but Keisha was already kneeling her hand on Jaylen's shoulder, checking his elbow. You okay? She asked, her voice softer now. Jaylen nodded once barely. Then she stood. No, she said louder now, turning to face Logan fully. This is my business. For a moment, the crowd shifted uneasy, sensing something unfamiliar, someone who wasn't afraid. Logan rolled his eyes. What, you her babysitter? He scoffed. Going to give me a timeout? Keisha didn't answer. She helped Jaylen back into his chair, with quiet precision, wiped dust from his sleeve, then looked him in the eye. You're good. Jaylen looked away, ashamed not of falling, but of being seen like that. Yeah, he said finally. The hallway monitor arrived late, of course, glancing at the scene and muttering something about reporting it to the office. But the boys were already melting into the crowd, leaving no footprints behind, as if cruelty could vanish if no one named it. But it didn't vanish, not in Keisha's mind, not in Jaylen's memory, and certainly not in the air that still hung heavy over Jefferson Middle School. The thing about injustice is that it rarely screams. It slithers quiet and habitual until someone forces it into the light. Keisha knew that. She also knew something else, that the school's annual Unity Challenge was scheduled for that afternoon. A series of team-building activities meant to teach inclusion, empathy, and respect. Most years, it felt performative, a way to tick boxes and appease grant requirements. But this year, Keisha saw something different, an opportunity. As students settled into homeroom, Keisha approached Ms. Sanders with a request. I want to compete, and I want Logan Carter on my team. Ms. Sanders blinked. Are you sure positive? And just like that, the first thread of reckoning was pulled. No one else knew it, yet not Logan, not Jaylen, not the crowd that had laughed and walked away. But by the end of the day, the ground beneath Jefferson Middle School would feel different. The rules were about to change. And this time, Jaylen Moore would not be the one left lying on the ground. He would rise, not in spite of what happened, but because of it. By noon, the heat in Birmingham had risen just enough to make the schoolyard shimmer, faintly in the distance like a mirage, and the grassy field behind Jefferson Middle School buzzed with the hum of preparations, the click of cones being dropped into place, the metallic clang of folding chairs, the sharp whistle of Coach Daniels barking instructions as students spilled out in uneven lines, some excited, others clearly wishing they could be anywhere else. The annual Unity Challenge had arrived, a state-sponsored day of games and team building designed to encourage compassion, empathy, and collaboration. But everyone knew the truth. It was mostly just an excuse to escape class-take group selfies and matching t-shirts and laugh through a few relay races before grabbing popsicles handed out by tired-looking PE assistants. But this year, something was different, something in the air, and only one person knew why. Keisha Brown stood at the edge of the field, with a clipboard in hand, her dark curls pulled back into a neat bun, a maroon Jefferson tee tucked into black joggers, and a quiet fire in her chest that burned hotter with every breath. She had spent homeroom pulling strings enlisting Coach Daniels, who was sympathetic to her cause to reshuffle the teams under the guise of strategic collaboration. She made sure Logan Carter, Derek, and Troy were all grouped together. And then she placed herself as their team leader. No one argued. No one questioned it, because Keisha had a way of speaking calmly and clearly enough to make resistance feel foolish. And now, as the students were called into their assigned teams, Logan spotted her at the front, holding the clipboard cool and composed, and his brows knit together with something between suspicion and disdain. Wait, she's leading us, Troy muttered, clearly annoyed. What kind of joke is this? Logan shrugged, cracking his knuckles. Whatever. Let's just get it over with. But Keisha didn't react. She simply walked up to the group, nodded once, and said, "Let's win." It wasn't a request, it was a declaration. The games began, sack races, water balloon, tosses, trust, falls, but none of it mattered. Not really. Because Keisha had her sights set on the final event, the obstacle relay, a complex course that ended with one team member having to push another across the finish line in a wheelchair, while the rider held a baton high in the air. Usually it was the goofy part, students laughing, pretending to swerve, falling into the grass on purpose. But not this time. This time it was loaded with meaning. And as the final event was announced, Keisha stepped forward with a subtle smile. "Let's make it interesting," she said loud enough for Coach Daniels and a few teachers to hear. "Winning team gets to pick someone for the principal's leadership lunch next week. Losers clean the cafeteria for a week." "Deal," the other teams murmured. Logan smirked. You got yourself a deal. 30 minutes later, the course was set. The sun beat down hard now, making the cones cast long, warped shadows across the grass. The relay would consist of 4 legs running, climbing, balancing, and finally, the wheelchair push. Logan took the sprint leg, Derek handled the hurdles, Troy the balance beam, and then came the twist. As they reached the final station, Keisha stepped to the side and gestured across the field. Logan, you're pushing, she said. Logan blinked. Pushing who? Keisha didn't respond, because just then, Jaylen Moore rolled out from behind a tent wearing a navy blue t-shirt, his elbow freshly bandaged, his jaw set with quiet resolve. His wheels gleamed in the sun. He didn't look angry. He didn't even look nervous. He looked steady, and that alone made Logan's mouth go dry. No way, Logan muttered. He can't. Rules say one teammate rides, one pushes. Keisha interrupted. Let's go. The other students began to gather along the sidelines, curious. Teachers leaned in. Coach Daniels gave a single whistle. The race began. Logan took off first, his ego fueling his sprint like jet fuel. He tagged Derek, who vaulted through the hurdles with mild chaos. Troy almost fell off the balance beam, but managed to recover. And then it was Logan again, jogging up to Jaylen, panting, hard eyes darting with discomfort. Jaylen sat, waiting, baton in hand. You ready? Logan asked, his voice almost sarcastic. Are you? Jaylen replied. Logan grabbed the handles and pushed. At first it was smooth. The first few feet were even terrain. But then came the cones, the grass patches, the small dips that could easily flip the chair if taken too fast. Slow down, Jaylen said calmly. You're tilting the frame. Logan grunted, adjusting. Sweat rolled down his temple. The crowd was silent now, watching, not cheering, not mocking, just watching. Something about the image, the boy in the chair guiding the boy who'd once shoved him to the ground, seemed to rewrite every rule the students had known. Then came the final stretch. Keisha stood at the finish line, fists clenched. Let's go, Jaylen, she shouted. Push it. Logan leaned in, his arms burning. Jaylen raised the baton high, his expression unreadable. They crossed the finish line. First, silence followed, and then slowly the applause. Not roaring, not obligatory, just real. A few students clapped, then a few more, then the teachers, until the whole field erupted in something that wasn't victory for a game, but for a shift, a turning point. Jaylen sat still, chest rising and falling, gripping the baton like a torch. He didn't smile, he didn't wave, he didn't need to. Behind him, Logan stood quietly, hands still on the chair grips, too stunned to speak. For the first time, he wasn't smirking. He wasn't in control. He was humbled, exposed, and maybe, just maybe, beginning to understand. The bell rang to signal the end of the day, but no one moved. For a long time, the students just stood there, processing what they had seen, processing what it meant. Keisha walked up to Jaylen and knelt beside him. You good? She asked softly. Jaylen looked at her and gave the faintest nod. Yeah, he said. For the first time today, yeah. They didn't need a trophy. They'd already won. And though the moment passed, its impact remained like the distant echo of a storm that had changed the shape of the land without anyone seeing it happen. The next morning, the air around Jefferson Middle School felt different. Not loud or celebratory, but tense with awareness, like the moment right before a storm, when the wind holds its breath and even the birds go quiet. Word of what had happened during the Unity Challenge had spread overnight, faster than texts, faster than gossip. Some students had seen it in person. Others had watched it through blurry Snapchat videos already recirculating, but everyone felt the shift, even if they didn't know how to name it. In the hallway outside the gym, where Jaylen had been knocked over just one day earlier, Keisha stood beneath a faded motivational poster that read, "Be the change." And for once, it didn't feel corny. It felt like a challenge. She stared at the floor for a long moment, the memory of Jaylen's fall playing over and over in her head, the way no one moved, no one helped, no one said a word. Not until she did, and that she realized was the real problem. Not Logan, not even the boys who laughed, but the dozens of others who watched and looked away. The silence, the bystanders, the teachers who arrived late, the system that let a boy fall and didn't demand an answer. So she walked into the main office, straightened her shoulders, and asked to speak to Principal Wallace. The secretary blinked surprised. Is this about the Unity Challenge, she asked. No, Keisha replied. This is about what happened before that. Within minutes, Keisha sat across from Principal Wallace and Ms. Sanders in the small conference room just off the main office. A single dusty globe sat in the corner, spinning slowly under the draft of the ceiling fan. Wallace leaned forward, fingers steepled, his eyes narrowed with interest. What do you want? Ms. Brown's suspension detention for? Mr. Carter. Keisha shook her head. That's not the point. Then what? Is Ms. Sanders asked gently. Keisha took a deep breath. Everyone saw what happened. They saw Jaylen get knocked out of his chair, and no one did anything. That's what needs to change. Not just punishment, but awareness, accountability, voice. Wallace leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowed. Go on. Give us 10 minutes at tomorrow's assembly, Keisha said. Let Jaylen and me speak. Let us show them what it means to stand for someone else, even when no one else does. There was a beat of silence. Then Wallace nodded slowly. You have it. The following day, the gym filled as it always did on character counts. Friday's bleachers packed with slouching students, half listening to announcements about grades and clean lockers, the usual applause for Student of the Month. Most kids barely paid attention, texting beneath their knees or doodling in spiral notebooks. Until Principal Wallace stepped up to the mic and cleared his throat with a note of finality. Before we close, he said 2 students would like to speak to you. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Heads turned, and then Keisha and Jaylen rolled forward, Keisha walking Jaylen, wheeling himself with slow, measured strokes. They stopped at center court beneath the overhead lights framed by the painted mascot, and silence that wrapped around them like a drum about to be struck. Keisha took the mic first, scanning the bleachers with steady eyes. Most of you saw what happened on Thursday, she said. Some of you laughed, some of you looked away, some of you did nothing, and maybe you thought that was okay. Maybe you thought someone else would step up. She paused. But here's the thing. Jaylen didn't fall because he's in a wheelchair. He fell because someone thought it was okay to make him feel small. And all of us let it happen. The room was still. Even the teachers stopped pretending to glance at their clipboards. Then Jaylen took the mic. His voice was quiet, but the sound system carried it to every corner of the gym. My name is Jaylen Moore. I've been in a chair my whole life, and I don't usually think about it until days like Thursday. When I get reminded that no matter how smart I am, how hard I work, or how kind I try to be, some people only see the chair. They see weakness, or a joke, or something broken. His voice cracked slightly, but he didn't stop. But they didn't see the hours I spent in physical therapy. They didn't see my mom crying because she couldn't afford the repairs last month. They didn't see the night I fell getting off the sidewalk and had to drag myself 20 feet in the rain to get home. They saw a chair. But I want you to see something else. I want you to see the kid who got back up. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged, filled with a mix of guilt and realization, of students shifting uncomfortably in their seats, of teachers blinking too fast. And then slowly the clapping began. 1 hand, then 5, then dozens, until the gym pulsed with something pure, not pity, but respect. Jaylen nodded once and handed the mic back to Keisha, who said only one more sentence. Next time, don't wait for someone else to speak up. Be the voice you needed to hear. They rolled off court together side by side. And in that moment, Jefferson Middle School was no longer the same place it had been just 2 days earlier. The culture of silence had been cracked, and from the fractures, something powerful had begun to rise. That afternoon, the school moved like it was waking from a long sleep, slow, uneasy, and blinking into a new kind of light. The echo of Keisha and Jaylen's words still lingered in the halls, like a held breath no one knew how to exhale. The usual jokes at lockers were quieter conversations, more fragmented, and even the hallway noise between classes had dulled, not from fear, but from reflection. Students who had once walked past Jaylen without a glance now noticed him. Some nodded awkwardly, others hesitated, as if unsure how to say something meaningful. And in the middle of that shifting current was Logan Carter, walking alone for the first time in as long as he could remember. His broad shoulders, once a magnet for high fives and shoulder slaps, now felt heavy, conspicuous. He wasn't being ignored. Not really, he was being observed. Not with admiration, but with scrutiny. The mask he had worn, the one of charm and bravado, had been peeled back under the heat of public truth. and now people saw something rawer, more human, and far less impressive. He didn't see Keisha or Jaylen until he turned the corner near the library. They were sitting together on the hallway bench, Jaylen with a paperback open on his lap, Keisha beside him, legs crossed pointing at a passage and laughing softly at something he'd said. For a second, Logan thought about turning back, slipping into the nearest classroom, pretending he had somewhere urgent to be, but he didn't. So instead, he walked up slowly, the way you approach something sacred or dangerous, and cleared his throat like he was trying to convince himself he had the right to speak. He started scratching the back of his neck. His voice wasn't loud or smug this time. It was unsure, fractured, like the words were climbing out of a space that hadn't been used in a while. I didn't mean for things to go that far. I was just messing around. I didn't think he'd... His words stumbled as if they knew they didn't belong. Keisha didn't blink. You didn't think, she said flatly. That's the only part of that sentence that matters. Logan opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came. So he turned to Jaylen, whose face was unreadable calm, in a way that made the silence feel deeper. I'm sorry, Logan said, finally. For real. I was being a jerk. Jaylen studied him for a moment. Not to make him squirm, but to decide what kind of response would matter most. I forgive you, he said at last. But I don't need you to be sorry. I need you to do better. Logan nodded once slowly, as if the words had weight and he didn't yet know how to carry them. Then he turned to leave, but paused. If you ever want help fixing that wheel, I'm pretty good with tools. Jaylen gave a small shrug and the faintest hint of a smile. We'll see. And that was it. No handshake, no hug, no dramatic closure. Just a moment. Real, honest, and more transformative than any punishment could have ever been. Because change doesn't always come with thunder or applause. Sometimes it arrives in the quiet space after an apology, when one person chooses to be better and the other chooses to believe they can be. By the end of the week, Jefferson Middle School didn't look any different on the outside. The bricks were still chipped, the hallway clock still 2 minutes slow, and the cafeteria still served pizza that squeaked when you bit into it. But the energy inside those halls had shifted like the first breeze after a heavy rain. It wasn't dramatic or loud, but it was there in the way students glanced at one another with new calculations, in the way a door was held open without a second thought as Jaylen approached, in the way someone who once giggled at a cruel joke now changed the subject instead. It started with the little things, a folded piece of paper left anonymously on Jaylen's desk that read, "You change the way I think. Thank you." A cluster of 6th graders who sat near Keisha at lunch just to ask, "How did you know what to say?" A teacher, Ms. Delgado from Social Studies, who began that Friday's lesson by pushing aside the textbook and saying, "Let's talk about what happened this week. Let's talk about power." And perhaps most quietly powerful of all, it was in the way Jaylen no longer wheeled himself with his eyes fixed on the floor. He looked up now. He saw who was watching, and he watched back. But change needs more than moments. It needs movement. That's why a week later, Principal Wallace made a surprise announcement over the intercom. Beginning this month, he said, we're launching a new student-led program called The Circle. It will be a space for dialogue, for listening, for being seen. Anyone can come. Everyone should. And just like that room, 204 became something more than 4 walls and mismatched chairs. It became a pulse, a heartbeat for a school learning to feel again. Keisha and Jaylen were the first to speak at that inaugural meeting. Keisha opened with a quote from James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. Jaylen followed with a single story, the night his wheelchair battery died outside the city library, and how 2 strangers walked past him like he didn't exist, before a man with a limp and 2 grocery bags stopped, asked if he needed help, and waited an hour beside him in silence until help arrived. That man didn't see a chair, Jaylen said. He saw a person. That shouldn't be rare. The room was quiet. Some students nodded. A few wiped their eyes. Even Logan came. He didn't speak, not yet, but he listened. And that mattered more. Because the truth is, culture doesn't shift when a rule is changed. It shifts when hearts are moved, when people lean in instead of away, when those who were silent begin to speak. And so, the circle grew. 5 students turned into 15, 15 into 23. They didn't solve everything. Kids still got teased. Some teachers still missed the point. But the school now had a rhythm it hadn't had before, a willingness to confront itself. And for Jaylen, the most powerful moment didn't come from a speech or a meeting or a policy. It came one morning in April, weeks later, when he rolled into the cafeteria a little earlier than usual, still groggy, still rubbing sleep from his eyes, and found his favorite corner table already marked. A small white card scrawled in messy handwriting was taped to the chair beside his usual spot. It read, "Reserved for Jaylen and Co." That was all, no big gesture, no shout-out, just acknowledgement. And in that tiny imperfect note, Jaylen saw everything he'd been fighting for. Not pity, not permission, but presence. Finally, they didn't just see the wheels, they saw him. Spring arrived early that year in Birmingham, brushing the air with warm breezes and the scent of honeysuckle drifting through open classroom windows, coaxing sleepy students into counting down the days to summer. At Jefferson Middle School, that meant end-of-year testing, classroom picnics, and preparations for the school's most beloved tradition, the Spring Talent Showcase. It wasn't just a show. It was a ritual, a rite of passage where students shed their classroom shells and stepped into the spotlight with tap shoes, guitars, comedy skits, and dance crews rehearsed in secret during lunch. The gym would transform into a makeshift theater packed with parents holding phones like trophies, teachers grinning with quiet pride, and peers screaming with support or secondhand embarrassment. Jaylen had never imagined himself being part of it, not seriously. Sure, he'd watched from the bleachers before, clapping along, pretending not to notice the way some acts turned into popularity contests, or how certain students always got the loudest applause, no matter how off-key they sang. He had never belonged in that spotlight, not because of his wheelchair, but because of the way people looked through it through him, assuming that someone like him was more suited for an audience than a stage. But that was before Keisha leaned against the magnolia tree near the track one afternoon and said casually, as if she were talking about the weather, "We should do something for the showcase." Jaylen glanced at her, unsure if he'd heard right. She nodded, chewing the end of her pen. "Yeah, you write all the time. That poem about the sky you showed me last week, that was fire." Jaylen shook his head, smiling slightly. "That was just for me." Maybe Keisha said, but maybe someone else needs to hear it too. The idea hung between them like a dare wrapped in hope, spoken word. She explained, two voices trading truths, weaving lines like a thread through the room's silence. Jaylen hesitated. Standing up to Logan had been one thing. Speaking in front of the school assembly had been another. But performing, art, vulnerability, on purpose. That was a different kind of bravery. Still something in Keisha's eyes, a mixture of expectation and belief, made him say yes. They spent the next 2 weeks in the library after school, hunched over notebooks, laptops, and crumpled drafts. They wrote about being invisible, about being misjudged, about what it meant to take up space in a world that prefers people who stay quiet. Keisha brought rhythm, rawness, fire. Jaylen brought silence, weight, and precision. They debated punctuation like warriors, argued over metaphors like philosophers, and edited each other's lines with the intimacy of trust. The night before the showcase, Keisha looked over the final printout and said softly, "No matter what happens tomorrow, we say it for us." Jaylen nodded. For us. And when the day came, the gym pulsed with nervous energy and glitter sneakers tapping against wooden floors. Names were called, students performed, laughter echoed. Then, Mr. Hargrove adjusted the mic stand, cleared his throat, and called them up. Next up, Keisha Brown and Jaylen Moore with an original spoken word piece. A hush settled over the room. Whispers floated. But as Keisha stepped out, first eyes forward, jaw set with the calm fury of someone who's been underestimated too many times, and Jaylen rolled beside her posture, tall hands steady on the wheel. Rims something shifted in the air. Not fear, not pity. Attention. Full, sharp, reverent attention. They faced the crowd, and Keisha began. "They told me quiet girls don't start revolutions. That stillness is weakness. That silence is surrender. But I've seen storms in still water, and I've watched thunder roll in on wheels." Without pause, Jaylen picked up the thread. "I've been invisible and unavoidable. A punchline, a question mark, a pause in your laughter. But now I am the period at the end of your assumptions." Back and forth, their voices wove together, like two rivers crashing into the same sea. Their words were not loud, but they were thunder. Their message was not complicated, but it was undeniable. "Respect," Keisha said, "doesn't ask permission. And strength Jaylen followed doesn't always roar. Sometimes it rolls. When the final line dropped, there was no immediate eruption. Just a moment of collective stillness, the kind of silence that felt earned, that asked nothing and gave everything. Then came the applause. Not polite, not reluctant, ferocious, thunderous. Trinity's mother stood at the back, tears streaking her cheeks, hands over her mouth. Principal Wallace wiped the corner of his eye with a tissue he pretended not to have pulled from his pocket. Even Logan, seated near the side with his younger brother, didn't clap at first. He just watched, silent, still wrecked in the best way. When the noise settled, Jaylen and Keisha looked at each other and grinned, not because they'd impressed anyone, but because they'd told their truth and survived the telling. And in that spotlight in front of their peers, they weren't outcasts. They weren't a girl who spoke too fiercely or a boy who rolled instead of walked. They were poets, warriors, voices. And finally, they were heard. The final week of school arrived not with fanfare, but with the soft unraveling of routines. Hallway bulletin boards, stripped of student work, teachers exchanging inside jokes about summer break. Lockers opening and closing like the last exhale of a long-held breath. Students wandered the halls with Sharpies in hand, scribbling yearbook signatures filled with hearts, arrows, and half-finished promises to stay in touch. Yet beneath the surface of the usual noise and rituals, something more permanent was settling, an invisible thread winding through Jefferson Middle School, pulling students into a new kind of awareness. Jaylen rolled through the library one last time, on a Thursday afternoon, scanning the familiar rows, trailing his fingers across the edge of the biography shelf, where he'd spent so many quiet hours escaping into stories where the heroes didn't limp or roll or apologize for their presence. He didn't expect to be interrupted, but that's when Logan Carter appeared, hands in his hoodie pockets, eyes uncertain, posture, hunched not with shame, but with something quieter, humility. "Hey," Logan said. No swagger, no sarcasm. Just that single word dropped like a pebble into the still water between them. Jaylen glanced up. "Hey." Logan took a breath. "I heard you're transferring to Washington High next year. Their program's better, right?" Jaylen nodded slowly. "Yeah. Special ed support's stronger. More accessible clubs. I'll get to join the poetry group there." Logan looked down at his shoes, then back up. "You're gonna crush it." It wasn't a compliment. It was a statement of fact. Jaylen didn't say, "Thank you." He just smiled, a small, knowing curve of the mouth that said more than any formal goodbye could. Logan turned to leave, then paused to the door. "If they don't see what you're capable of, that's on them." And then he was gone. Not with the slam of drama, but with the quiet weight of someone who had finally learned the difference between loudness and leadership. Outside, the sun painted the sidewalks gold. Keisha stood beneath the magnolia tree where she and Jaylen had first dared to speak their truth, waving as he approached. "Got your yearbook?" she asked. Obviously he grinned. "But you're not signing it? You're writing me a poem." "Deal," she laughed. They made a pact there beneath the branches. Check in every Sunday, no excuses. Keep writing, keep pushing. Keep living loud even when the world prefers quiet. And though Jaylen would leave Jefferson and Keisha would stay to lead the school's first ever Student Diversity Council, the bond between them felt unbreakable, like a scar that doesn't hurt anymore, but reminds you how strong you were when it did. As Jaylen and his mom packed the car that weekend, she handed him a folded letter. "Read it later," she said. Inside, written in her looping cursive, were just 6 words. "You made them see your light." That was enough. Back at Jefferson, the changes continued, not overnight, not perfectly, but persistently. Keisha drafted equity plans. New students joined the circle. Teachers began weaving identity and empathy into their curriculum, not as side notes, but as starting points. And no one laughed when a 7th grader asked why the ramps were only at the back entrances. They started listening, because listening had become part of the school's language now, part of its rhythm. And though many students would forget the details of dates and tests and locker combinations, they would not forget what happened that spring. They would not forget the boy who rolled through their halls and left behind something far heavier than silence. He left legacy. Summer stretched long and golden across Alabama, painting rooftops in shimmering heat and turning sidewalks into silver rivers of rising warmth. For most kids, the season was an exhale, a time to forget. But for Jaylen Moore, it was something else entirely. It was a doorway, a threshold, a breath before the next sentence. He and his mother packed the car with quiet precision, rolling his wheelchair up the ramp they'd saved all year to install folding clothes into labeled duffel bags, tucking away his notebooks like artifacts, each one heavy with memory. Their destination, Washington High, a school 25 minutes across town that boasted better accessibility, stronger support programs, and most importantly, a poetry club that didn't just tolerate difference, but centered it. The drive was quiet at first, the radio playing a soft mix of soul and jazz as they crossed bridges and neighborhoods that marked the distance not just in miles but in meaning. When they arrived, Jaylen expected the usual stares, polite smiles, the awkward overcompensation of adults trying too hard to act like the wheelchair wasn't there. But what greeted him instead was a girl with dyed green hair and combat boots who pointed at his notebook and asked, "You write?" He blinked. "Yeah, good," she said. "You're reading at open mic next week. No invitation, just expectation." And that changed everything. By the second week, Jaylen was attending poetry workshops in the cafeteria after hours where kids sat in circles on the floor, trading stanzas like secrets and editing each other's metaphors like surgeons. The room buzzed with voices, some shaky, some fierce, but all of them unapologetically alive. And when his turn came, Jaylen rolled to the front with his notebook balanced on his lap, cleared his throat, and began. He didn't perform. He didn't shout. He just told the truth line by line about a hallway, a fall, a moment of silence that became a revolution. When he finished, the room stayed silent for a second too long. Then the girl with the green hair stood and said, "I needed that." Others followed, applause, snaps, hugs. One teacher asked to use his poem in class. Jaylen didn't cry, but something inside him settled like a boat, finally finding dock after years adrift. Meanwhile, across town, Jefferson Middle School felt his absence like a shadow that reminded them to keep the lights on. Keisha Brown had stepped into her own storm. As co-leader of the Student Diversity Council, she launched a mentorship program called Mirror Hours, where older students really listened to younger voices. She hosted weekly dialogue circles, and when kids argued, she didn't silence them. She asked them to dig deeper. "What are you really afraid of?" she'd say. "What are you trying not to feel?" Room 204 became a sanctuary for honesty. Some days were messy, some broke hearts wide open, but no one left unchanged. And above the lockers that lined the east wing, the school unveiled a new mural designed by Keisha, painted by the art students over the course of 3 weeks. It showed two figures, one seated, one standing, both looking straight ahead, faces unflinching bold black outlines against a riot of colors. Above them were 5 words in sharp block letters: "Respect doesn't ask for permission. No plaque, no explanation, just truth." And that was enough. Teachers pointed to it. Students took photos in front of it. New 6th graders walked by it and asked, "Who were they?" And the answer would come softly like legend. That's where it started. Because the real power of stories isn't in how loud they begin, it's in how long they echo. And Jaylen's, it was still echoing. Every hallway, every mic, every time someone chose to speak up instead of stay silent. His story didn't end with applause. It began with it. Back at Jefferson Middle School, autumn crept in quietly, brushing the trees in shades of copper and gold, scattering dry leaves across the sidewalks like stories waiting to be told. Inside, the school had begun to move to a new rhythm, one Keisha Brown had helped orchestrate not with a baton, but with relentless intention. The Student Diversity Council now met twice a week, and what began as a room of awkward silences had transformed into a circle of trust, honesty, and messy, meaningful dialogue. Students from every grade showed up, some timid, others angry, some just curious, and they spoke about things that used to live only in whispers: race, disability, gender, fear, belonging. Keisha sat in the center of it all, not as a leader who barked orders, but as a mirror who reflected courage back at everyone brave enough to share. But even as momentum grew, there was still one person who hadn't spoken. Logan Carter came to every meeting, sat near the back, listened, eyes always down, shoulders always tense. No one pressured him, not even Keisha, because growth she'd learned couldn't be forced. It had to rise from within like smoke from a quiet fire. And then one Thursday afternoon, as rain tapped gently against the windows of room 204, and the group was mid-discussion about labels and how quickly they stick, Logan raised his hand. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but in that room, it was thunder. Keisha blinked. "Go ahead," she said, voice steady. Logan cleared his throat, his voice not loud, but sharp enough to cut the silence. "I used to think being strong meant people were afraid of you," he began. "That if you could control a room, make people laugh or shut up, then you were winning. But then I saw Jaylen, and I realized real strength is the opposite. Real strength is when people feel safe around you, when they feel seen. I didn't do that. I made people shrink. And that's something I gotta carry." The room was still. One of the 8th graders, Maya, who rarely spoke, nodded slowly. "Thanks for saying that." Logan gave a small shrug. "I didn't say it for a thank you. I said it because I've been quiet for too long." And just like that, the circle widened. Keisha didn't smile. She didn't need to. Because watching someone choose truth over ego is its own reward. After that day, Logan became a different kind of presence, not the loudest, not the most polished, but dependable. He helped set up chairs before meetings, volunteered to help with mural upkeep. When a 7th grader was mocked for wearing an ankle brace, it was Logan who stood between the bullies and the boy, saying simply, "Nah, not here, no applause, no witness, just integrity." And as the first parent-teacher night of the semester approached, Principal Wallace asked Keisha to prepare a short speech. She stood at the podium, hair pulled back, Jefferson hoodie neat, and spoke not about policy or programs, but about people. "Change didn't come because we planned it," she said. "It came because we faced something hard and chose not to run, because one boy refused to stay invisible, and another decided he didn't want to be, feared he wanted to be better." Among the crowd, a few parents wiped their eyes, teachers clapped, and in the back row, Logan sat beside his younger brother, who whispered, "She's talking about you, isn't she?" Logan didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just kept listening, because sometimes the best thing you can do with your past is grow beyond it quietly, consistently, and in front of the people who once knew you as something else. And in that slow, steady growth, Logan was becoming the kind of strong Jaylen had spoken about, not with noise, but with presence. At Washington High, Jaylen Moore was becoming something of a quiet legend, not because he sought it, but because he carried his truth like a banner no one could ignore. His poems were no longer confined to notebook margins. They echoed through open mic nights, found their way into zines passed from locker to locker, and once even appeared anonymously taped to the inside of a stall in the boys' restroom, titled, "This Stall Sees Everyone." He never claimed it, but those who knew his voice didn't need a signature. His world had widened, friends who saw beyond the wheels, teachers who challenged him with respect, a community where he didn't have to explain himself before being heard. Still, there were days, quiet moments under autumn skies, or in the hush of the school library when his mind drifted back to Jefferson. Not with bitterness, but with a strange tenderness, like remembering the first time you stood up for yourself and heard your voice echo back. It was during one of those moments, flipping through a stack of student-lit mags in the Washington High Library, that the envelope arrived, thin white with a return address that made his breath catch. Jefferson Middle School. The handwriting was careful, like the writer had rewritten the address 3 times before getting it right. He opened it slowly. Inside was a short note from Keisha, handwritten in blue ink. "Hey, poet," it began. "Next Friday is Jefferson's Fall Forum. You lit the fire, we're just keeping it going. We want you back, not for a speech, for a reading. Come remind them where it started." She didn't sign it with love or friendship, just a single line at the bottom. Still writing, still rising. Jaylen held the paper for a long time. He hadn't been back since the last day of school. He hadn't wheeled through those halls since the morning after the assembly, since the mural went up. Part of him feared returning, feared that people would still see the chair first. But a larger part, the one that had faced down silence and won, knew this wasn't about fear. It was about full circle. So, the following Friday, he and his mom made the drive back across town. The sun was lower now, casting long golden fingers through the trees lining the school parking lot. Jaylen's chest tightened as he rolled up the same ramp where months earlier he had been knocked down. Only this time, no one blocked his path. In the gym, folding chairs had been arranged in a wide circle. Students filled them, new faces, familiar ones. Some teachers, and at the center, Keisha, beaming like the light she'd always been. When Jaylen entered the room, quieted not out of awkwardness, but reverence. He wheeled to the center, nodded once, and pulled a folded paper from his lap. No mic, no stage, just his voice. They called me fragile before they knew my name, he began. Like wheels were a warning, like silence meant fear. But I've been louder in my stillness than some boys in cleats will ever be. I've fallen, and I've risen, not in spite of what I carry, but because of it. The room was breathless. Even Logan, seated 3 rows back, mouthed the final line to himself. When Jaylen finished, there was no need for applause, just presence, just acknowledgement. Afterwards, students came up quietly, some with poems of their own, others with thanks they couldn't quite put into words. Keisha hugged him without a word, and Logan approached him not as a shadow of regret, but as someone reborn in humility. "It's good to see you," he said. Jaylen nodded. "It's good to be seen." And as the sun dipped low over Jefferson, the building didn't feel like the place where Jaylen had once been knocked down. It felt like the place where he stood not on 2 legs, but on truth. What began as a moment in a middle school hallway was now becoming something else, something larger, more fluid, less containable. In the weeks after Jaylen's return to Jefferson for the fall forum, videos of his reading, shaky and grainy, but unmistakably powerful, made their way onto social media. First, it was a few reposts from students, then teachers, then a local activist group tagged it under "Jan Shu Roll with Respect." Within days, a regional youth equity nonprofit reached out to both Jaylen and Keisha, asking if they'd consider speaking at their winter summit on student-led change. Keisha responded with a screenshot of Jaylen's original poem and a caption, "He's the truth. I just hold the mic." Jaylen hesitated at first. Spotlight still made his heart race, still pulled at old insecurities like loose threads. But when he stepped on stage at the Birmingham Youth Equity Summit in December, in front of hundreds of students and educators from all across the state, the nerves melted beneath his words. He didn't perform. He didn't raise his voice. He just told the story, of falling of silence, of being lifted not by noise, but by someone who saw him. And when he looked up at the end, there was a standing ovation. Not for theatrics, but for truth. Keisha followed with her own talk, not a poem this time, but a blueprint. She broke down how the circle had grown from 5 students into a school-wide model, now being piloted in 2 other districts. She shared templates, conversation prompts, real numbers. "Emotion wakes people up," she said, "but structure keeps them standing." Afterwards, students surrounded them both, some from rural towns, some from inner-city schools, some from places that had never even heard the word accessibility used outside of elevators. A girl in glasses handed Jaylen a folded drawing of him and Keisha beneath the Jefferson mural. A boy from a neighboring county told her, "Our principal's scared of what you're doing, but my mom's on the PTA now. We're coming for it." Something was happening, not a trend, not a viral moment, but a shift. Back at Washington High, Jaylen launched a lunchtime writing circle for students with disabilities. They called it the Quiet Storm. Membership doubled in 3 weeks. Some days they shared poems. Other days they just talked about what it felt like to be stared at, pitied, ignored. One kid, Ezra, confessed he hadn't raised his hand in class for a year because a teacher once skipped over him when he stuttered. Jaylen didn't have a solution. He just said, "We're listening now." That was enough. At Jefferson, Keisha worked with the art teacher and history department to launch a new unit called Narratives of Power, a student-led storytelling project. Instead of essays, kids wrote monologues. Instead of tests, they held a school-wide performance night. Logan, quiet as ever, surprised everyone by reading his piece titled "The Wall I Built." He talked about the weight of living inside a role you didn't choose and the fear of who you'd be without it. When he stepped off stage, the applause wasn't thunderous. It was earned. And in the quiet that followed, Keisha saw something bloom in him, like light filtering through brick. By the end of the semester, Jaylen and Keisha had spoken together at 3 more youth events, helped advise 2 other middle schools, starting their own student circles, and were invited by a statewide education board to consult on inclusive programming. Neither of them wore blazers. Neither of them quoted policy. They just told their truth, and every time they did, someone new stood up or rolled forward, because that's how change happens, not with noise, with witness, with one story that finds another and says, "You're not alone." Years passed. The paint on the Jefferson Middle School mural faded slowly under sun and storm, its bold lines softening its colors, bleeding into brick. But even as weather peeled the layers, the message remained etched deeper than any brushstroke ever could. Respect doesn't ask for permission. Students still passed it every day, some. stopping to stare, some just brushing by without knowing its origin. But the story behind it had rooted itself in the soul of the school, in whispered retellings and teacher references and orientation packets for new students who would hear. That's where it started. Jaylen Moore went on to publish a book of poems before graduating high school. The title, Stillness is Not Surrender. His dedication page simply read, "To the ones who rise without being asked." Keisha Brown received a full scholarship to a university that had once told her their diversity program was full. She now teaches community activism at a charter school where every student is required to speak their truth once per semester, minimum. But long before degrees and awards, it was that hallway, that fall, that moment when a boy hit the pavement and a girl didn't look away. That was the spark. And sparks, when protected and nurtured, become fire. Not the kind that destroys, but the kind that warms and illuminates, the kind that reveals who people really are when no one is watching. Jaylen and Keisha didn't change the world in one afternoon. They didn't stop every bully. They didn't end silence. But they created space for others to be seen, to be heard, to choose courage when fear is easier. And that was enough. Because real strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it rolls. Sometimes it kneels beside a fallen friend. Sometimes it speaks up in a quiet room, even when your voice shakes. And sometimes real strength is just two students, one standing, one seated, facing forward beneath a sky that no longer feels like it's pressing down. It feels open, endless, waiting like a page, and every generation after them picks up the pen. So maybe real strength doesn't come with fists or loud voices. Maybe it rolls through the hallway with quiet dignity. Maybe it stands beside the fallen even when no one else will. Jaylen didn't ask to be a symbol. Keisha didn't plan to be a leader. But together, they sparked something that outlived the moment, something that turned silence into action and pain into purpose. And now, it's your turn. If this story moved you, if you've ever been overlooked, or if you've ever chosen to speak up when it counted, drop O in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And don't forget to subscribe to Flow Story, because every week we bring you stories that don't just entertain, they awaken.